Ryan McCaffrey from IGN here. In this IGN Unfiltered interview segment with Richard Garriott, aka Lord British, the creator of the Ultima RPG series, talks about going to outer space. Yes, he actually went. Let's hear from him. There are so many good stories. I'm not even going to start with your gaming career. Okay. I am curious, you said in your book that you used to be big into setting up haunted houses. And so you actually wrote in the book, it was not unreasonable at all for the person inside that cage that you'd set up in said haunted house to think they were going to die. A thought, by the way, that we greatly encouraged. And then you mentioned that people wetting themselves in your haunted house was your measure of success. You're kind of a prankster, aren't you?
Oh, definitely. You know, in fact, these haunted houses that I did, that's actually, in many ways, is the forerunner to everything from my gaming, like paper gaming with Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah. Definitely a forerunner to the computer games, and that prankster attitude pervades my life, to this day, where family, friends, and employees are not free from well-orchestrated pranks. Although I become the target also quite commonly as well these days. Oh,
I've got to hear a good story or two, because you mentioned stuff with pyrotechnics and fire, and what's the most freaked out you ever got somebody in one of your haunted houses?
Oh, well, the haunted houses were extreme, and as you noted, we would, I put these on for free. They were never anything I charged money for, and so as opposed to most haunted houses where you put through as many people as you can to charge whatever you need to pay for whatever you've spent.
Right.
Ours were sort of the exact opposite economically. I'd spend whatever I chose to, and we'd only let as few people through as it could handle well. And so generally speaking, once you started in, you were on an hour-long adventure for just you, and you never saw other people in front of you or behind you. And so you felt very alone, and we put up these physical challenges for you to get past. You might have to literally paddle or swim or climb or swing on a rope across a chasm. But the biggest scares were things like fire, where we used this oil well fire simulator that would send 100-foot flaming rolling donuts of fire into the sky while you're barricaded in by walls of fire that are created by propane burners from hot air balloons.
Yeah.
And the sand that you're walking through has been so impregnated with oil that has fallen out of the sky that it is also on fire. So you're walking through lacy fire, bounded to stay close to this central effect by walls of fire as these explosions are going off of your head. And that's just one example of these pretty extreme environments.
How did no one ever sue you? Did you make people sign waivers before they came in?
We did make people sign waivers, although I did actually have somebody serve me once who twisted their ankle on a swing once. But shockingly, we never really had any serious injuries.
So that was while you were an adult, after you had some success. But I want to go back to your childhood for a minute, because it sounded like in the book that your parents were pretty cool people. Your dad was an astronaut. They just sounded like they were very supportive of your creativity, because you write in the book that you used to take stuff around the house, just take it, disassemble it, and then try to put it back together.
And usually fail to put it back together. But yeah, no, I was definitely the person in the house who, when any new technological thing came in, a record player or a piece of electronics, I would almost immediately disassemble it and tear it down to its base components, and then use, for example, the motors out of a turntable to make my Ferris wheel operate of my Lego or Tinker Toy constructed devices. Then I'd get yelled at. I'd go try to put those parts back, and inevitably I never was successful. And some of those earliest creations I still have. I mean, literally, I have a Lego submarine on my desk at my home right now that is hollowed out in the rear, that I could put some batteries in, and a little motor that I stole out of some other device that I disassembled as a kid, that I keep to this day, except my 4-year-old recently disassembled part of it, and I had to remember how to put it all back together.
You also tell a story. You used to impress your friends by lighting your hand on fire.
Yeah, don't do this at home, kids. Don't do this at home. Don't do what I did. But yeah, because this is, as part of this experimental age, I don't remember how, if a friend showed me this or how we learned this, but this little group of pyro friends that I had in my neighborhood, we had learned, and you can do this, if you take a can of lighter fuel, if you put a little dot of it on the ground and light it, you can actually touch the lighter fuel and you'll pick up a little tiny bit of it in your finger, and it will evaporate at about the rate it burns. And so your finger actually does not get hot. Well, once you realize you can do that, you of course dip it deeper, dip it deeper, dip it deeper, and you actually realize that you can actually dip your hand in lighter fuel, and it will actually burn without burning you until you get to the last layer. That final layer that's no longer left any room for evaporation suddenly gets hot, and so you have to be prepared to put it out appropriately. So that's, again, don't try this at home. Don't do this at home. But I did. These were the sort of dangerous experiments I would run as a child.
So you are pictured on the cover of the book in your full astronaut gear here. You did go to space. That is.
I did.
That has become every bit of, I think, a calling card for you as your game development career. And I just have a bunch of questions because you are the first astronaut I've ever had the pleasure of meeting, let alone interviewing.
Yeah, and as you know, my father is also an astronaut, so I'm the only second-generation American, and I was the 483rd person to leave the Earth.
Which is, I almost wouldn't have thought it was that many. But
well, having
still
grown up with it, it's still pretty. Compared to the population of the Earth, is still very small. But of course, I grew up around it with not only my father, but my right-hand neighbor was Joe Engle, another astronaut. Left-hand neighbor, Hoot Gibson, another astronaut. And all of the people that you think of from the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo era live within a few blocks.
Yeah, you grew up in Houston.
Yeah, and so all my neighbors were, if not astronauts, they were all engineers involved in putting people into space. And so my own household and all of my neighbors' households were constantly filled with these experiments. Not the things I disassemble. I wouldn't disassemble the NASA materials, but those were always around all the time. So it was a very inspirational place.
So did you always want to go to space because your dad's an astronaut and that's sort of what you grew up as? Wow, that's what Dad does.
Well, it's interesting. I think every kid grows up believing they want to be an archaeologist and an astronaut, or if you're a fireman or policeman, these sort of things. And I think I had the same brief thoughts, but it was never sort of my life's goal to become an astronaut professionally. For me, it was when I was about 13 years old, one of the NASA doctors told me that because I needed glasses, I was ineligible to be an NASA astronaut. And that, to me, at the age of 13, was like being kicked out of the club that you just assumed everyone was a member of. I just assumed we were all going to go to space. I didn't have to decide. We just all do, right?
Everybody in the neighborhood did.
Everybody does. Yeah. Everybody goes to space. And so I was sort of kicked out of this club before I really had the chance to decide if that's what I wanted to go do. And that moment made me decide, well, who is that doctor going to be, the gatekeeper of space? If I can't go by that person's rules, I'm going to make my own rules, build my own space program, which, of course, at the age of 13, you don't do much about. But ultimately, that's what I did. Yeah,
I mean, your story of just even getting to space is probably as interesting as being in space itself. You had very dangerous surgery in order to be able to go into surgery that's completely medically unnecessary by
Earthbound.
Terran standards. Yes.
Yeah, no, that's true. In fact, of all these ups and downs of trying to get myself into space, 13-year-old told you can't go. First start selling games, I start backing other astronauts as they depart and a bunch of those companies fail. Finally build this company, Space Adventures. We negotiate with Russia. We managed to get it arranged to go, and the stock market crashes. I finally...
Which, you had a lot of money tied up there from
the internet.
EA days.
Exactly. Yeah. So even though I finally managed to arrange a ticket, I couldn't pay for the ticket that I just arranged because of the stock market collapse. Finally, in 2008, I'm now prepared to go again. Another market collapse is occurring. But more importantly, I've now paid, tens of millions of dollars to Russia, which I will not get back.
Right.
And I get this phone call from Russia saying, we have found a medical anomaly which will disqualify from space flight. I'm very sorry. Thank you for the money, but you can't go. And I'm floored. I mean, I've spent 30 years.
You're a healthy guy.
I'm a healthy guy. And unfortunately, I get a call about 2 hours later saying, well, we have a plan. And the plan is you have to go in for this major surgery on Monday. And this was like a Thursday afternoon. And what the problem was is I had one lobe of my liver. A lobe of your liver nominally has an artery that feeds it and a vein that drains it. I was missing one vein. And so I have one lobe of my liver that is sort of a dead-end blockage and just doesn't function. And on Earth, who cares?
Right.
But if there was a depressurization of a spacecraft because of a collision, which has happened, that depressurization could create internal bleeding, which you couldn't detect. And even if you could detect it, you couldn't fix it while you're in space, and so you would die. And what they called me up and said was, if you go to surgery on Monday and remove that section of your liver, and then you can survive these high G centrifuge runs without any other things happening internally, then we can pass you. And so I was like, sign me up. And the doctor I went to see was, his sincere advice. He said, Richard, I have to tell you, as a professional, as a doctor, my advice to you is don't go, because this is life-threatening surgery. You can live out the rest of your life here on Earth and wouldn't care. But he says, if you insist, I will do it, and I will have to consider it sort of a professional requirement that you have the surgery, just to rationalize it from his perspective as not inappropriate to give me this surgery. But I have a scar now that goes from my sternum to my belly button to the side of my body that I often will show off. It's a party trick, And it
was like a year recovery, you said in the book?
Well, I only had 3 months before I had to start training. So within 3 months, in fact, within a month and a half, I had to do these centrifuge runs, 9G centrifuge runs, which was also problematic, and I also had some medical issues show up during. So it was really very touch and go that they would let me do it. But it was, I'm overweight at the moment, but post surgery, I was underweight by 20 pounds, 30 pounds, that they also were concerned about just because of how much weight I lost just to this surgery.
Yeah. So. Were you terrified to go to space? I mean, I'm already discerning that the answer is no, considering what you were willing to go through to get there. But when you're sitting there in the rocket and you're looking up, does fear set in at all?
Honestly, not only no for me, but I actually don't think most people would find the launch process scary. I mean, you're aware of the risks. I mean. And there are 2 points where people might think of it as scary. Like, if you are at all claustrophobic, you will not like getting in a Soyuz. A Soyuz is so small to cram into, and I'm an avid caver as well. And there are caves that are small enough they're psychologically uncomfortable even to me, who's not claustrophobic. Well, the Soyuz is pretty crammed. And the next kind of most awesome time is when you're on the outside of the rocket getting ready to board it. Because you're standing next to this vehicle that is full of cryogenic oxygen, and so there's frost all over the outside of it. Moisture coming near it is condensing and streaming down the sides of it. The whole thing is creaking and groaning and popping, as it all adjusts to its temperature.
Yeah.
And when you stand there and look up at this thing that you eventually go climb up and get inside of, that's a moment where you go like, this is a bomb. This is literally. Would devastate, kilometers around it if something were to go wrong right now. And during the countdown, you of course, statistically things are probably going to go just fine. But as you're going through the checklist, you're still have a part of your brain is going, what will it feel like if the escape tower launches, right? There's going to be this bam, if that happens, there'd be a kick. And so there's part of you that's sort of trying to feel what's happening around you just to make sure nothing anomalous has occurred. But the actual launch sequence itself is actually very smooth, very elegant, very blissful. Nothing about it there's no shaking or bangs or violence, and so it's very beautiful.
You probably can't go on roller coasters anymore at this point in your life, or at least get any thrill out of them.
No, I actually really love roller coasters. And by the way, a roller coaster is not a bad comparable in the sense of if you go over the first drop on a big roller coaster. Is close to 0 G, on the way down, and the pull-up is about 3.5 to 4.5 Gs, which is exactly what it is on a rocket. And in a rocket, you're lying on your back compared to sitting up on a roller coaster. So it's actually more comfortable in the rocket than it is on a roller coaster. And roller coasters also tend to be violent and kind of throw you up and down and left and right, which a rocket doesn't do. It's kind of slow, continuous pressure on your chest. So it's that you are moving really fast. You're accelerating really fast because you feel this incredible amount of load, this weight on your chest that stays.
Gravity crushing you as you're trying to escape it.
There's an elephant sitting on your chest, and that lasts for about 8.5 minutes, but only 8.5 minutes. I just flew here today from New York, and when you lift off from a runway till they turn off seatbelt sign is more than 8.5 minutes. It might be 10 or 15 minutes, and so it's shorter to go to orbit, which is only 250 miles up, than it is to get to altitude on a modern jetliner.
Huh. How about re-entry then? Because that would be, in my head, that would be the other super terrifying time. Like, okay, we did it, I was in space, but oh no, now I have to come back. How's this going to go?
Well, you're correct that that is the other statistically hazardous time. I mean, no one's actually ever died in space. The people have only died on the pad on the way up or the way down. And so you're aware of the fact that reentry is the other extreme event. And what's interesting about that is, as soon as the capsule reenters at all, as soon as you even touch the uppermost part of the atmosphere, where the number of molecules that you're encountering are still very small, so there's no resistance. You don't, if you were to float a marble in front of you, it would still float. Yet those atoms you're hitting at 17,000 miles an hour, and that is literally ripping the molecules apart. And that's creating a plasma that is hotter than the surface of the sun. And so immediately the vehicle is surrounded by this red glowing plasma, and the vehicle begins to melt. And you see the heat shield kind of melting away out the window, and you still don't feel it, and you don't hear any sound of wind whistle or anything. But the fact that the vehicle is melting is sort of a
little terrifying.
You know, that's kind of an extreme place to be. You know, with your shoulder sitting just you know, there's a few panes of glass and quartz and things that separate me from the sun, basically, and yet it's still, you know, it's not hot on the inside. It's quite cozy, and but intellectually you do understand that it's dangerous. But again, it doesn't. It's not. There's no violent shaking, no loud noises or bangs, so it's still very you know, comfortable.
So what is the most interesting or weird thing about, I'm sure you've been asked this a million times, what's the weirdest or most interesting thing about being in space that us, those of us that haven't been, which is most of us, have just never even considered, that sort of surprised you when you got there?
Well, there were lots of surprises. I mean, there are things that I expected that were as great as I would have hoped, like floating around in zero gravity is phenomenal. I mean, and I've had zero-G flights where you get a little 30-second taste of it, but flying around like Superman 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is just incredible. And the view out the window back at the Earth is also just incredible. But there are things that would happen, both real and imagined in the sense of dreams, that were unexpected and kind of interesting. For example, when you're asleep at night, or right as you're falling asleep, you know, you're exposed to very heavy radiation while you're in orbit. A lot of these subatomic particles from the solar wind are destroyed as they enter the atmosphere, but they're not while you're in space. And so instead they go through your body. And that's a risk for you, this radiation exposure, but it also has an effect you can detect in real time periodically, which is that every now and then one of these subatomic particles will go through either the retina on the back of your eye or some structure in your brain associated with vision. They're not really sure which. But the net result of it is you see it. And so you'll be here lying in a quiet, dark state, you know, relaxed, and suddenly, at least the way I would describe it is, it's like you're looking at a pixel on a monitor that goes dead by first going super bright and then fading out to nothing. And it wakes you up, you're going like, wow, you know, whatever just happened, you know, something important, some neuron was just obliterated in my brain. And you're going like, oh, I'm not sure you want to stay out here forever. So but that happens a few times, you know, on the trip.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. So is it like once a day, but it sounds like every few days?
Every few days, usually at night as you're trying to go to sleep.
So yeah, you were up for 12 days, is that correct? Mm-hmm. So were there any mornings where you woke up and for a second forgot you were in space, or like, oh my gosh, that's right, I'm in space right now?
Well, yeah, well, the whole time you're in space is a bit of a blur in the sense of you're so excited to be there, and the senses are so overwhelming that I find it very hard to go to sleep. And then if you're not feeling like you can be asleep, you don't want to just be sitting here wasting the time doing nothing, and so you're motivated to go look out a window or just there's so much to see, you know. So you're constantly in this, you know, I need to go see things. But there were these times where these kind of things I'm about to describe would happen. Like, I'd love to go take pictures of sunrises and sunsets because you get those once every 45 minutes, right? You're going around the Earth. Wow. You're going all the way around the Earth in 90 minutes, which means there's a sunrise or sunset every 45 minutes. But most all the windows aim straight down. There's no windows that aim at the sky, the space above you. All of them aim down, except for a few that aim to the peripheral. And so I would go to the Russian airlock, where it had some forward and aft facing windows to take pictures of sunrise and sunset. And I'd take my camera and I'd have some pockets and things I'd kind of attach, and I'd carry more extra gear and extra lenses. And I'd go down there and sit by the window, and I'd take my pictures of, let's say, sunset. Well, as soon as the sun set, you have to understand that in space, you're either in the sunlight, in which case it is incredibly bright, or you're in darkness, in which case it is incredibly black. And there's nothing in between, really. I mean, except for the few moments of sunset itself, which goes very quickly. And so I would constantly forget that once it goes black, I'm stuck. Because I'm in this room where not only have I brought more gear than I can now find as it floats around and bounces off the walls, but they also store stuff in here like empty spacesuits that are floating around or hatches that are floating around. And so you're in this dark kind of minefield, asteroid field, you might think of it as, swimming weightlessly through the sea of things like bodies and metal hatches, and it's incredibly surreal. And that's what I would have for dreams. Like that moment, I had dreams both in space and on the ground, this kind of swimming through asteroid fields of debris in space.
I've got to ask you about your pooping in space story that you told in the book, because it's just like, I don't think any of us really think about that, but it turns out it's a whole ordeal, and also that the forces on your body are such that you don't need to go as often, but when you do, it's time.
You really got to go a lot. Yeah, well, what's funny is there's actually books you can go buy on the internet. There's a book called How to Go to the Bathroom in Space, and other stories. And the story that almost every astronaut tells about going to space is they tell the story of the way you were trained to go to the bathroom in space. No one, other than myself, to my knowledge, tells the actual story of how troubling it is to go to the bathroom in space. The simple version of it, first with the training version, and if you read How to Go to the Bathroom in Space book, this is what it will say. The toilet is sort of like a small telephone booth. It has a receptacle for solid waste. It has a receptacle for liquid waste. A bunch of switches and knobs that I'll ignore for now, but it's actually fairly complicated to turn it on and off for reasons of zero gravity. But basically, it's a funnel you pee into for liquid waste,
Sure.
which works fine, and that's easy. But the solid waste receptacle is the problem. And it's basically a beer keg bolted to the floor with a shoebox-size toilet seat with a lid and a receptacle about the size of your water bottle that fits down inside of it, with a plastic bag with a rubber band that holds it at the top. The plastic bag goes down into the shoebox and has perforations in the bottom, and the same vacuum hose you could have peed into is attached to the bottom of it. So in theory, if I were to release M&Ms, for example, above this, airflow would pull those M&Ms into the plastic bag.
Okay.
Then you could release the top of the plastic bag. It would be sealed by the rubber band. It would fall into the beer keg, and you'd put a new plastic bag for the next user. That's how you go to the bathroom in space.
Okay.
So that's the official way. The problem is, first, you haven't gone to the bathroom in a long time because your GI tract slows down when you're in space because gravity's not helping it. You're not walking around in ways that help it. So when you finally do need to go, you've got 5 or 6 days of backup.
Yeah, you're backed up.
And when you begin to use, situate over this plastic bag, a column of, I like to use toothpaste as the metaphor. You imagine toothpaste squeezing out of a tube.
Yeah, it's easy to picture.
But if you think on Earth, if I were to squeeze toothpaste out of a tube over my sink, gravity would bend it down toward the sink, and eventually, after 10 grams or so was out, gravity would pull that off, break it off, and fall in. But if you do that in zero gravity, it'll just stay there, right? And so, without gravity, if I try to move the toothpaste tube away from the toothpaste comes with it. And so when you sit over this container and you begin to go to the bathroom, you quickly create a column to the bottom of the bag. And if you try to continue, it just sort of spreads out on your backside. And you're going like, that's not comfortable, and it's probably going to make a mess, so what do I do? And everybody sort of figures out the next move, which is kind of give a bounce, because that tends to break things, like shaking the toothpaste off the tube. But now you have an obstruction in the bag.
Oh, no.
And so you start again, but now you have the same problem happening, but even sooner, half as long. And you're going, well, now what do you do? And the only other things other than you in this room are baby wipes, which is your equivalent of toilet paper,
yeah.
Rubber gloves in case you needed it, and the more of those plastic bags for installing for the next user. And you realize that you could clean up, discard that bag, and do this process over and over again, but that would take dozens of bags, and use up the supply on the space station. And so instead, everybody figures it out. You put on the rubber glove, get out some wet wipes, and you sort of manually manipulate things out of the way to continue, and then you kind of repeat this process. And it takes you like 45 minutes. And so by the time I got out, I'm sweating.
It's a whole production.
I've used all the stuff, and the other crewmember's like, I guess you figured it out. And it's really hilarious that one, no one ever talks about it. Two, no one's made a better toilet. After years and years and millions of dollars being spent on toilets, I could go through the pantheon of toilets that have been invented for space, and they're all worse than the one I just described. That's still the best toilet. In fact, the newest toilet up there is a new American toilet, but what they did is bought a Russian toilet and added water recycling to it, urine recycling to it. But otherwise, it's a Russian toilet. It's still the state of the art.
So you're probably happy to only have to go every few or several days.
Yeah, so I think I made 3 solid waste deposits, and that was enough.
The things we don't think about in space. Would you go back if you got the opportunity to space?
In a heartbeat. I mean, if somebody came knocking on the door and said, there's a vehicle waiting right now, I'd go, even over the objections of my wife and kids. So I didn't have a wife or kids at the time, and so now I do, need to consider their concerns as well. And my wife has asked me to, at least wait till the kids are old enough to remember me before I go take that kind of a danger. But I actually am fairly circumspect about it in the sense of not only did I grow up with it, but I also believe the statistics are better than most people think. It's not as nearly as safe as you and me sitting here right now.
Yeah.
But it's not as dangerous as a lot of activities we do walking around on the streets of New York these days.
You mention another spacefarer in your book briefly, and in fact, you have a quote from him on the back of the book, Elon Musk, who I'm a big fan of. How do you? Is it through the? He obviously is the CEO of SpaceX as well as Tesla. How do you buddy up and get to know Elon Musk?
Well, Elon actually is a gamer, first of all, and he and his kids nowadays are also big gamers, and so he's played my games and a lot of the other games in our industry. And I met him about the same time that I met my wife. It turns out in this case on vacation, and it's where I met my wife in the Caribbean. But very quickly, not only hit it off because we're both into space and games and other things that are common interest, but also with his young kids, I like these haunted houses. I'm also big into things like geocaching and stuff like this. And on this island where I met my wife and him, I would set up geocaches for now his kids and my kids.
That's cool.
And so we have a good time together gaming.
If I interpreted the passage correctly in the book, you said that you could have gone on a space walk if you'd paid more money.
True.
So when you're already up there and you're paying the price, why not take the upsell? Why not take the spacewalk?
Oh, I would have. I actually intended to. So, but the problem was I literally couldn't afford it. Which is one of the ironies of the up and down part of this tale is even when I was going to college before I dropped out of college, it was ironic to see people like, for example, Buzz Aldrin came to see me in my dorm room at the University of Texas to pitch me on investing in his private space venture, which was the ability to have boosters from rockets return with wings as opposed to being expended, which, by the way, is a very good idea. It was a good idea then. It's still a good idea today.
Well, Elon's landing rockets.
Now he's doing it with controls. I mean, back in those days, we couldn't have done it. There was not enough computer controlling to do back then. But so even as a kid, it's pretty surreal to have your childhood heroes and neighbors, coming by saying, "Hey, only kid in the neighborhood who's made any money. How would you like to invest in my ability to do this privately?" And so I've been investing to try to get my way into space forever. And I had the money to go when we convinced the Russians to take private citizens, and the New York stock market crashed. I had the money to go when I did go, but literally just as I was starting to pay is when the 2008 market crashed. And so when I started down that journey, I had enough to not only easily pay for the flight and easily pay for a spacewalk, but then also would have remained wealthy, for the rest of my life afterwards, had the 2008 meltdown not happened. And I actually saw it coming, but I had all my value was in a Korean stock, which you're not allowed to, for technical reasons, you're not allowed to what's called collar a stock. They didn't want me to sell it, and I couldn't buy an instrument to hedge it legally. So I didn't, and therefore I almost couldn't take the flight at all it did mean I didn't get to make the spacewalk, and it also meant that when I returned to the Earth right after my space flight, I was broke again. So
Jeez.
I've had this happen. I've had this up and down cycle, multiple times. I've never had to declare bankruptcy, but I have, come basically to zero at least a few times.
Well, at least now you've got an incentive to go back to space, is to take the spacewalk, right?
That's right. Yeah. Well, and the good news is that if you're interested in space, that and I bet 80% of people on Earth, by the way, if you ask them, would say I would love to go if I could afford it. It used to be only governments could go. We're the only private company, the first private company that began to take people into space, still the only. But when we did it at first, because we're buying from a government who really, frankly, wasn't that interested in flying.
Yeah, you wrote that NASA tried to actively stop you from going, which is all in the book. You should read the book.
But also the cost is very high. So it was tens of millions, it's still tens of millions to go with Russia. And even when SpaceX first starts to carry people, it will still be tens of millions. But with these reusable rockets, as SpaceX is proving they can do quite well, the price should come down to ones of millions. And the price previously with the space shuttle was 100 million. And so we're already down 100 times cheaper.
Wow.
And that's still a lot of money, but 100 times cheaper means a lot more people could consider it. And there's technology like my wife has been involved in helping to promote, where you, instead of carrying the fuel with you, use externally beamed propulsion or externally beamed energy for the propulsion, and that should bring it down by another factor of 10. And so we're entering a time where the price is coming down very, very, very rapidly. And so even though I don't expect, or I wouldn't want to prove or predict that I can afford to put the amount of money into a second trip that I did into my first trip, even for a spacewalk. But I do believe the price is coming down so fast that it'll all be fine, because by the time the price gets down to where I can afford it again, my kids will be old enough, my wife will let me, and the price will be cheap enough to where it won't be a big deal. We'll take the whole family.
So before I move on to your video game career, which is how normally video games what we do here at IGN, but of course we do love science and technology as well. You also wrote a very fascinating story about taking a high-tech submarine of sorts to the bottom of the ocean to go look at the Titanic remains.
That's true.
And you almost got stuck there. You actually did get stuck there.
Did, in fact.
And you were contemplating death for a short time down there.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so most of your viewers have probably seen the movie Titanic. And that was filmed using these two submersibles called Mir 1 and Mir 2 that are owned by the Russian Academy of Sciences. And that's another company that I've been a partner in, is called Deep Ocean Expeditions. And they charter these two submersibles. And in fact, James Cameron chartered those subs for that movie from our company, Deep Ocean Expeditions. And so we used, he went down to the Titanic to film the movie. We took the same subs to go down to see the Titanic ourselves. And I've also used those same subs to go twice to hydrothermal vents and once on a expedition to do archaeology and recovery down to a ship off in the Atlantic.
Cool.
So I've done these subs quite a bit. But what's interesting about these subs is, as with other exploration I do, whether it's Antarctic, space, or subs, or others, I'm a big believer of you need to know everything about this. I don't go as just a vacationer. I go as an expedition.
Yeah, part of the crew.
Part of the crew. The same thing's true in the case of the submarines. And so I learned those submarines in detail. While I was not the driver, if the driver had become incapacitated, I could have easily taken over if required. I knew all the safety systems. I knew all the life support systems, all the acoustic radios. And so it's an incredibly safe vehicle. It seems.
Unless you get wedged under the...
Until you go down underneath the tail, under the stern of the Titanic, which means the majority of the mass of the Titanic is above you. And in our case, we bumped into the Titanic. And the Titanic is rusting into pieces. And so all of this debris goes on top of us. And so now we're going, uh-oh. Because the submarine, you can eject anything that's sticking out. The propellers, the remote manipulating arms, the sample trays, battery packs, lead weights that you carry just because, nickel shot weights you carry, all that stuff can be dumped. So you become incredibly positively buoyant. But if you're sitting under the Titanic,
you're not floating.
You're not going up through it. And it turns out that your intercom, your radios, are acoustic, which is line of sight. So again, no one can hear you. And your last line of defense is a buoy you can send up, but if you're underneath the buoy can't go anywhere. And then you go, oh look, we are literally now stuck, literally. And then you go, how much time do we have? You've got about 2 or 3 days of CO2 scrubbing and oxygen, plenty of water, but then that's it. And even if they could find you, with the way of the Titanic on you, the other sub, even if they figured out that's where you were, which is going to be hard to figure out, but even if they did, there's no way they're going to clear off the Titanic. And so that was an interesting moment to realize, wow, just like the people who were in the Titanic originally feeling so confident in the unsinkability of their vehicle, here we are sitting under the tail of the Titanic, having just in a moment defeated all the safety equipment.
But you were able to, it was once all because your lights were obscured by all the sort of
debris,
dust that was kicking up. Once you were able to regain vision, you were able to kind of see that you
Fortunately, what came down on us was nothing heavy. None of the big iron girders or panels came down on top of us. Mostly it was the rusticles and other very fine, lightweight things that could disintegrate. And so we just sat there for a couple of hours to let it all settle out, and then tried to lift ever so slightly, which we could, and then we just rotated in place, just bumping on the mud on the bottom, until we then could scoot out past this berm which we were trying to get over in the first place, why we hit the Titanic, and then turn back around to see what we had done, and it was all right. I mean, it turns out it was really just a bang, but we actually broke a bumper off of a titanium bumper off the rear of the sub we had broken. But otherwise, the vehicle was not harmed, and the Titanic was not really harmed.
What was seeing the remains of the Titanic everything you hoped it would be?
Yeah, what's interesting is it was an amazing trip, and especially amazing was we sat and had lunch on the deck of the Titanic, literally. The scenes you see in the movie, like the submarine will just fit into the grand staircase, so you can look down those hallways and see the chandeliers hanging.
Wow.
But so it was like the movie. It was a lot like the movie, but the movie did a very good job of showing you what it would like to be there. I mean, it's very comparable. And while some of the people on the trip did feel this deep reverence for the grave site that it is represented, but yeah, it was really a fascinating trip. That was my first submarine trip.
And that was just one of the fascinating topics I spoke with Richard Garriott about. Be sure to check back each and every week for a brand new segment on IGN Unfiltered.